Sid Caesar was the Mount Rushmore of American comedy. His brilliant sketches delighted Groucho Marx. They inspired generations of comedians, from Lenny Bruce to Mel Brooks to Billy Crystal to Jerry Seinfeld. His fans also included Albert Einstein and Leonard Bernstein. Caesar was also a candle in the wind, burning brightly across America's TV sets for just 8 years in the 1950s before NBC snuffed him out. David Margolick, author, Silurian raconteur, consecrates Caesar with this meticulously investigated and eloquent biography. Welcome.
Thank you, Tony. Now what?
Now what? Well, that's about it. I praise the book and
Thank you and good night, as
Thank you
my
and
friend
good night.
David says at Birdland at the beginning of every set.
I don't know, Mel Brooks. I'm thinking about what you wrote early in the book. Mel Brooks told you at some time in the preparation of this book that he was proud of you, that you had captured, in his view, the essence of the comedic genius that Caesar was. But he said, when you do the book, David, you're going to get this question. Who was Sid Caesar? So, David, who was Sid Caesar?
Well, this is the interesting thing that when I interviewed Mel Brooks, I taped it all and I transcribed it afterwards, and only years later did I go and listen to it again, and I had not transcribed that remark, and it just jumped out at me, and because it so perfectly encapsulated what had happened to Sid Caesar, that he had once been so incredibly famous and had become so forgotten, and it perfectly summarized the arc of his life. And so now it's one of the epigraphs in the book. I mean, it literally is the first word of the book. And this is sort of characteristic of Mel, that Mel takes over any project, and he has the first word in my book, and he also has the last word, because he gave the eulogy at Sid's funeral. So there he is, but the story is really about Mel Brooks, the man who revolutionized American comedy and came along and was really the first comic creation of television.
Sid Caesar.
Sid Caesar, and set the course for television comedy from that point forward. And there were other comics, obviously, in early television, like Milton Berle, and the famous stories of all the toilets flushing at the same time during his commercials. But that was, somebody actually measured that, apparently, and that was all sort of warmed over, recycled stuff from vaudeville and radio. And Sid was a young man who came into television and was sort of perfectly suited to it, and intimate but original, and set the course for everything that was to follow, and put out this live show every week for 8 or 9 years. There were 3 different shows. Your Show of Shows is the most famous one, and the one that people generally lump all of his shows into, but there were in fact 3 separate shows starting in 1949 and running through 1958. And then he was just burned out. I mean, you put on a live show once a week for 8 years, and there's nothing left. And Mel actually describes that he was spent.
We'll get into some of that, but first, I think I want you to explain why you call him the unlikeliest of comics. He was introverted, ill at ease, tongue-tied. And some of his teachers and others thought he was impaired. So you're talking about this great comedic genius who didn't know much about how to live and be Sid Caesar.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Carl Reiner said that Sid Caesar was shortchanged on charm. He was really pretty much dysfunctional. He didn't talk for the first several years of his life. and was very sort of maladroit with people, and sort of opaque, impossible to read, who compensated for his discomfort by devising a different kind of comedy. And you'll see that the hardest part of his show every week was introducing the guest star, was starting out. He simply could not put together a sentence or two at the beginning of the show because he was so awkward being himself. And you see him running off at the end of, the introduction. And it's not just to start the next sketch, it's to sort of get into a world that he was comfortable in, which was playing someone else. And there are all these different tributaries to his comedy, different aspects of his comedy, like double talk, where he's imitating all these foreign languages, something that came out of his father's restaurant in Yonkers. He grew up in Yonkers, and it was a working class restaurant where the workers sat by nationality. All the Polish workers sat at one table, and all the Italian workers at another, and the Germans at a third. And Sid had this kind of musical ear for languages, and he said, I could listen to a language for 15 minutes and pick up the sound of it. And that became one of the leitmotifs of his career, but it was also a refuge from genuine conversation, right? As was his pantomime. And he was a great pantomimist, and he's always sort of hiding behind his comedy.
He did the pantomimes usually at the end of the show, and they were the highlights. And to sort of put a bow on what you were saying about his discomfort, you quote Carl Reiner as saying of him that the only character Caesar couldn't play was himself, and for a simple reason. As Reiner put it, he didn't know who Sid Caesar was.
Right, and they didn't, and all of the people who worked with him didn't know who the hell he was either.
Right.
They used to sit around discussing him and trying to figure him out because they didn't have much more of a clue than anybody else.
There's a very poignant scene early in the book. Caesar is about 11 years old. He has been playing a saxophone. And in junior high school, he's scheduled to play a classical piece. And the story involves that saxophone, a music stand, and stage lights that were too bright. Tell that story.
I mean, even the saxophone is an important element of Caesar's career. As I said, his father had this restaurant in Yonkers, and they had a boarding house upstairs, and someone had left a saxophone behind.
A deadbeat, yeah.
A deadbeat, had skipped town and left the saxophone behind, and that was how Sid got connected to the saxophone. And he later said that it was a good thing the guy hadn't left a shotgun behind because he would have turned to crime. I mean, he was an angry guy, like a lot of comedians. Anyway, and on this night, he was performing on the stage, and the spotlight tried to catch up with him. I mean, he had to keep moving around to catch up with the spotlight, and he discovered that every time he moved around, he got laughs. And he thought, hey, this is kind of fun. It's kind of nice to get laughs. And that was his first encounter with performing on a stage and comedy.
You have him saying in the piece, in the part of the scene in the book, you have him saying it was awakening to one of his talents for the first time. And you write it so well that when I read that, I put the book down for a second or two because my imagination that you had inspired with this scene, my imagination saw Charlie Chaplin in a light with a music stand and moving it, and it gets a little laugh, and he moves it again. It was maybe Mel's first silent sketch.
Well,
in a way.
Sid was a great fan of the silent comedians, Chaplin and Buster Keaton, and other comedians of that era, Laurel and Hardy. And he was very influenced by them, and he talked about them all the time as the major influences in his life. And later on, I mean, he restaged silent comedy on his show, and it's really brilliantly done. And it was sort of an homage to his own comedic origins. And there's one silent film sketch that was done late in his run, which is just astonishing. I mean, I don't think, like a lot of Caesar's stuff, no one has seen this for 60 years. Because, I mean, Caesar's comedy, one of the reasons he disappeared was that his show was on for 90 minutes, and it had all these sketches of different lengths. It was never intended to be broken up into half-hour pieces, and so it was never syndicated. So it didn't live on the way that I Love Lucy lived on, which was on film. And
NBC also didn't think enough of this star that they had to preserve. There were
kinescopes, right.
But they didn't preserve them.
So all of this stuff just disappeared. I mean, later on, when cable TV started, he tried to cut it up. In fact, some of his original tapes are dismembered because he had to cut them up. He tried to cut them up in order to fit them into half-hour slots. And it never, I say that, it appeared on all these cable TV stations with stratospheric numbers, channel 1021, at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that was the only way that this is before YouTube, and it was the only way that you could ever see his stuff. So it all just vanished. A lot of the stuff is on YouTube now, but a lot of it is not. And I think, I'm the only person who's watched this stuff in 60 years. And it's just sitting there. I mean, for instance, all of the, one of Sid's famous characters was the fraudulent German professor, right? The guy with the top hat and the battered clothes, who's an authority on everything. And this would appear like every other week. And these were written by Mel Brooks, principally. And it's just this enormous cache of early Mel Brooks that no one has seen forever. And they're all just sitting at the Paley Center and the Library of Congress and UCLA, where all of Caesar's stuff is assembled.
Is that he did dozens of professors.
Right, yeah, professors on everything.
Is that the guy who, Professor Kurt von Friedekat?
Well, that was one of them.
The guy who was supposedly an expert on mountain climbing, wasn't he?
Yeah, right.
And Carl Reiner asked him something about what happened. What advice do you have if a mountain climber his ropes break? You remember that?
Yeah, listen, I'm going to let you finish the story because you know it better than I do.
And according to the book, Reiner and he are doing.
Right. Reiner is the interviewer,
and so the Professor von whatever
Friedekat
says, well, you should scream a lot. Because on the way down, you should scream a lot because that'll help people find you when you land. And Reiner goes on to, but isn't there anything else you could do? He says, well, you put your arms out real like this and you fly. You really just work hard, you wave, and you fly. And Reiner says, but Professor, humans can't fly. He says, what do you mean? How do you know? You could be the first one. If it doesn't work out, you can go back to screaming. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. That was great. Yeah.
No, that's his writing, and that's Caesar's genius.
Well, that's Mel Brooks's writing, really.
Mel Brooks's writing. Well, you wrote it, so that I could.
Yeah.
Just
I excavated it.
You excavated.
Yeah.
We're going to show. That's why this screen is here. We're going to show some of the material, some of the great sketches, and just before we get to the first one, I thought a little summary would be in order to move Sid from high school to NBC, and quickly he in 1942, of course, there was the war, and he joined the Coast Guard. There was a review called Tars and Spars. And he was in it, he was featured in it, and the director of that was a man named Max Liebman, producer and director. And Sid's comedy in that thing's killed, of course. And as Rick Blaine says to Captain Reiner at the end of Casablanca, this is the start of a beautiful friendship. And it was the start of a beautiful friendship. Liebman introduced him, brought him to a meeting with Pat Weaver of NBC in 1949, and in 1950, your show of shows is on the air 90 minutes a week, 39 weeks a year. And one of the highlights, and the sketch that you feel is perhaps his best, and your quote about it also is the longest and lustiest laughter before or since in the history of television.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's right. And I should say to all the journalists in the room, beginning with Arthur Sulzberger, that I learned at the Times that you never say anything is the first or the most or the only, because inevitably you get a letter, right? But my claim that this is the longest laugh in the history of television remains uncontradicted.
And people are going to see why right now.
Welcome, America, and hi there, everybody. Once again, we present This Is Your Story. As you know, each week, we give you the intimate inside story of some person's life. Now, that person might be anywhere in the audience tonight. It could possibly be your life, sir. Yes, sir. This is your story, Al Dunsey. Seems to be a little overwhelmed by Al. He's a little Al Dunsey. Al boy. This is your story, Al. Now come on up here, Al. Yes, sir. Come on up here, Al. The intimate story. He's a little overwhelmed, a little overwrought, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you'll just come this way, Al. Al Dunsey. This is going to be the story of your life. We're going to tell the intimate inside story. Dunsey, this is a night you will long remember because this, Al, is your story. Al, I know it's a little overwhelming, but this is a night you won't forget soon. Let us turn back to page 1 of your story. Do you recognize this voice, Al?
Hello, Al. Remember me? I used to encourage you. I helped you in those desperate years when you needed help.
Uncle Goopy!
They're certainly happy to see each other, aren't they? Now, just sit down here, Al, and we'll get on with your...
You once showed that sketch to John Cleese of Monty Python.
Right.
What was his
he
reaction?
was on a cruise. We were on a cruise together, and he just was bent over with laughter. And he thanked me afterwards because he had never seen it before.
I mean, it's a masterclass and more in physical comedy, but there's a lot going on there. Talk a little bit
Well,
about.
in fact, it's quite uncharacteristic of Caesar's comedy because Caesar's shows were very tightly scripted. There was not a lot of improvisation. They were very disciplined. They were very proud of being disciplined, and they had a show that had to come in on time. There were 3 separate deadlines in a way. Every half hour had to end precisely at the 30-minute mark. And this show is unusual because it was at the end of the run of your show of shows. They had already announced the show was going to be canceled. And I think they sort of they let themselves go crazy with this show. In that sense, it's uncharacteristic. And you've done some very judicious editing on this show because this sketch goes on for 11 minutes. And like the first time he hears Uncle Goopy say, I used to encourage you, he listens, and then he says, can I hear that again? He doesn't know who it is, and he has to hear it again before and Howard Morris, who plays Uncle Goopy, keeps going back again and again and again. And he won't let go because he can see that the laughs are coming, and he figures that's what this is all about. I don't care what Sid says. I'm going to keep going. And he kept going, and he also thought he was the third banana on the show, and he thought, this is my chance to shine, and I'm just going to show the world who I am. So all of this is going on at the same time that Carl Reiner, who was the disciplinarian on the show, is keeping this sketch on schedule, and it ended within a few seconds of when it was supposed to. So it's an extraordinary, also the fact that they got it all on camera, and you didn't cut to the chase, you cut the chase on this because in fact he's running up and down the aisle, he runs across the stage, he runs down the other side, and then they finally drag him up on the stage. So all of this goes on for a longer period of time, and somehow, nonetheless, Carl Reiner is implicitly watching the clock and keeping this thing on schedule, because this is all on. There are 20 million people watching this as it unfolds, and there it is, live TV.
Yeah. Part of you touched on an aspect without really pointing it out, that another aspect of Caesar's genius was that he wasn't selfish. He saw that Howie Morris was getting great laughs with what he was doing, and so he went with it. He let it happen.
He let it go, and he just had a sense for how much he could let it go. And then it all stopped, and the thing kept moving. In fact, there are 3 more people who come out.
Yeah.
After the clip that
including
you just showed.
a sexy blonde.
Including a sexy blonde, and it's a mistake because in fact she was meant for next week's program.
And when Carl Reiner says, she comes out and Sid Caesar's gorgeous.
Right.
She was a model or something. And she's in like an evening gown, and Sid goes crazy, and he embraces her, and they're kissing, and and finally Carl says, Al Duncy, who was it? I don't know, and he keeps, I have no idea.
He says, I don't know, but it's okay with me.
Yeah, that's
what he says.
Let's talk a little about the writer's room, which of lore was a delightful and wonderful and inventive place to be, at least in Neil Simon's lore of the movie The Laughter on the 23rd Floor, but it was hardly that at all, if, the way you presented in the book. Sid, you call it a brutal room.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. All of these guys were competing for Sid's attention and favor. All of these very talented, ambitious, aggressive, neurotic young Jews, basically. That's how Larry Gelbart described the writer's room of Caesar's Hour, as 8 or 9 neurotic young Jews beating their own brains out.
They were all in psychoanalysis.
Right, right. And Mel Brooks said we could have gotten a group rate. There's a story about when Joe Stein got hired for the show. Everybody asked him who his shrink was, and he said he didn't have one. And they were astonished. This was after when he first came in. He could hear vomiting going on in the background, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, Sid just came in." Every morning Sid would go to the bathroom and puke when he first came in. Anyway, it was a very competitive atmosphere, and one of the first jobs of a writer really is to is to disabuse people of the myths. And one of the myths was that this writer's room was a wonderfully happy place where everybody was working in concert and supporting one another and frolicking around and coming up with this novel comedy every week. But in fact, it was an aggressive and unhappy and very competitive place. And there's a wonderful story that I encountered from Frank Rich. Frank Rich originally Frank Rich started my book like 30 years earlier, right? Frank Rich, who was about to be hired at the Times, thought that one could do for Caesar's writers what Roger Kahn had done for the Boys of Summer. Right, and sort of write this sort of nostalgic book about young people working together, instead of playing on a baseball team, creating all this wonderful comedy. And he set out to interview all of the alumni of Caesar's shows, and only to discover that they were all bad-mouthing each other in every interview, that they were just saying terrible things about each other. Some of this was reported at the time, actually. In one of the stories, two writers who hated each other happened to run into one another on the street, and one of them said, we really should get together sometime. Why don't you and your wife come over sometime for dinner? And the other one said, we don't eat anymore. So that's the way that they really felt about each other. So part of my job was to correct the record. Anyway, so this is what Frank encountered. All these guys were saying terrible things about one another, and he promptly abandoned his book project. Right, and he said to me, instead of finding the Boys of Summer, I found the Angry Jews of Winter.
Well, he should have written that book.
Yeah.
Last thing on the subject of the writer's room, the quote that Sid gave you later, much later in his life, about what that room was. You remember this quote?
No, you remember it better than I do.
Well, I write them down.
Yeah. You wrote it down.
Mel Tolkien, he was the head writer.
Mel Tolkien was the head writer.
Canadian guy, very, very dour. And Sid said Mel Tolkien's customary place in the writer's room was by the window, contemplating suicide.
Right.
Let's talk. You mentioned food, or you mentioned binging. Caesar had a prodigious appetite, and he did binge, and he ate everything in the world, and he drank too much also. Food, you say in the book, is an absolute fixation and a core theme of Show of Shows. We have a sketch that may illuminate that, and with the help from the folks over there, I'll just set the scene. It's set in a boardroom of a corporation. Sid is the founder of the company, or the CEO. The issue is that the other board members are fighting over the idea of whether they should have a merger, and Sid, the CEO, has other ideas.
And we should have really arranged with the kitchen here to have pickles on the table for this.
Yes.
Nonsense, you call it! These stockholders are expecting us to Are forgetting one very important thing. Lunch!
I have here the figures to prove that at this time, a merger with Continental Utilities is extremely financially compatible.
lunch?
Now, if you gentlemen would just bear with me,
lunch?
I'll read you a few.
Come on!
Gentlemen, our reserves alone in cash, as well as in bonds, including accounts receivable and
Did you put the tea in the
our profits?
Why'd you put it in there? You're not supposed to put it in. I want to dunk it myself. I don't want to put it in with you. You understand it? I want to go on without that. What do you mean next time? Next time, will you continue about it?
Being as large an organization as we are, and supposed to have such vast business experience, truly...
Mr. Sandwich.
Yes, Mr. Jackson?
Where's my sandwich? Anybody got 2 sandwiches there? You don't have 2 sandwiches?
No, I only have one.
You don't have 2 sandwiches? My sandwich.
again, gentlemen, let me say that I am not unprepared at this juncture to refute these statements. Now, gentlemen, listen. My staff is on 5 years to start over the accounts of comparative action of this murder idea, and I say that we must risk it. And indeed, we have possible proof. Remember, our entire corporation was built on this. We can't stand for extinction. Take off this law. Replace it with our regulation. Gentlemen, as I was saying, risk. We speak of risk, however. Let me tell you, this is calculated risk. And we must. Remember the college thinking. The ups and downs of the business market. Gentlemen, this is something we must. We cannot.
There's so much more Sid and food in the book, but David told a wonderful story at the official book party. Excuse me, the official book party for this book, which was by the way, at Barney Greengrass. And I think you can very well tell us why and what Sid told you when you asked him late in life and when you interviewed him, how did you know, or when did you know you had made it?
Well, yeah, this was the reason why we had the book party at Barney Greengrass, that he was describing when he knew that he had really arrived. And he said that he would order sturgeon from Barney Greengrass, and he said, I didn't care, even if it was $5 a pound, I could have as much as I wanted. And that to him, was an indication that he really had hit it big. And I mean, one of the, it's true as Tony said that many of the sketches on the show revolve around food. This one somehow got past the censors. I don't think anybody realized that the pickle could be deployed in the way that it was here, and the censors were asleep on this. But one of my challenges in doing the book was to describe why there are so many food-obsessed sketches. I mean, for instance, another classic one is Imogene taking Sid to a health food restaurant, right? Because all Sid wants is a steak, and they're bringing out, they're bringing out these plants that, the lunch is served in a flower pot, and you eat it with trowels. I mean, it's like a forerunner of the scene in Annie Hall. There are a lot of forerunners in Caesar's comedy. And anyway, so one of my challenges was to describe what this was originally for a Jewish book series, this book. And so one of my challenges was to describe what there was in Caesar's humor that was Jewish. And one of the conclusions was that it's so obsessed with food. And I had to wrestle with the question that everybody has to eat, and every ethnic group obviously has its own culinary traditions, like the Italians, for instance. And if you watch The Sopranos, I think is second only to Caesar's show in its obsession with food. Anyway, so I had the privilege of interviewing Mimi Sheridan. I figured I got to find out what it is about Jews and food. And I said to her, I had breakfast with her, and I said to her, I mean, what's the difference? I mean, the Italians care about food every bit as much. And she said, yes, the Italians are just like the Jews, but without the panic. Which you look at that sketch, he's panicking.
Yes. I should point out that color TV came in I guess, a very primitive form of it in, I think, 1953, and color TV sets were scarce, and even your footnotes are terrific, because I picked this up out of a footnote, and you take it from there.
Well, you have the exact quote from the footnote there. If not, I'll look it up in the book, because I don't want to screw up my own.
It here. Let me
I don't want to screw up my own story. I mean, while you're looking, Footnotes are a great underutilized resource among writers, and particularly newspaper writers, because we don't have the option of using them. And oftentimes, you have stories that are just, they're a slight distraction, but they're too good to leave out, and that's what footnotes are for. Did you find
I didn't
You
find
didn't
the
find
exact
it?
quote, but I thought the reason we should at least tell the story of what happened.
Well, no,
is-
in fact, I'm going to step on you because I'm going to
Yeah.
get the. I don't want to blow this. This story is too.
I didn't find it in the book. I found the story, but I don't remember the quote. Anyway, while he's doing that, we'll have a musical interlude from Lawrence Welk. Lawrence Welk, as David is searching, Lawrence Welk was responsible for ending Caesar's career.
No, this is a footnote. Let's see. Many of you have seen the famous Caesar sketch with the Bavarian clock, where they're all figures with the clock, and that was the first thing that was actually done in color for the 5 people who had color TV sets. You could have actually seen that in color. So I say that here. The beginning of the rainbow, NBC called that closed circuit broadcast, and you could see the figures on the Bavarian clock now appeared in red, pink, green, and turquoise. Footnote: jockeying for scarce color sets. Barely 8,000 of them were made in the first 6 months of 1954, was intense. The publisher of the New York Times, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, tried wangling one from NBC through Jack Gould. Some of you will remember Jack Gould, the veteran TV writer for the Times. Quote, "It is not clear whether he wishes to have a set on loan or to purchase one," an NBC executive wrote to General Sarnoff. This thing went to the very top of NBC. What to do with Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, and how to handle him, and how to keep him happy. However, go back to the quote from the executive, "However, in view of Mr. Sulzberger's importance, I am bringing this to your attention to see what can be done."
And what?
So, well, I think they probably ended up loaning him one, quote unquote, which he probably never returned. But I don't know. I don't know about that. But that's the kind of thing. NBC's papers are at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and you get a story like that, and you think you got to use that in the book somewhere. You can't leave that out. So
Of course not. Especially since his son is here today. His grandson. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I told Arthur that story already.
Okay. Well, now everybody knows it. There's a chapter called That Championship Season, which was the 1954 season, which happened to be the final season of Show of Shows before Caesar's Hour came the next year. And the opening sketch of that show was a spoof of a movie that had opened only 2 weeks before, starring Burt Lancaster and Deborah Carr, and it was called From Here to Eternity. Here's Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca's version of part of that.
Isn't the ocean beautiful tonight?
It's the most beautiful ocean in the whole world, especially tonight.
It makes you feel sort of close to nature.
Makes me feel sort of close to you.
Out here on this beach tonight, I can forget the dance hall with all the smoke and the noise and the dancing.
And I could forget the tough sergeant on the treatment.
Monty, I love you.
I have been waiting an eternity to hear those words from you, Duchess. Here amongst the ocean, I can see you in a different light. See you not as a hard-boiled dancing girl, but as a lost person. And I'm going to find you, whoever you are.
Monty, do you really mean that?
Every word.
Monty, I used to dream of a knight in shining armor, who would get and an enchanted castle. Since I found you, I don't dream that anymore.
Kind of rough tonight, ain't it?
David mentioned earlier that the show was tightly scripted. And Liebman, who was the producer, Max Liebman, didn't like the actors going off script. And that line that...
Where he says, kind of rough tonight, ain't it? And that he improvised that, which is very unusual. And there were stagehands on ladders sort of pouring the water down on them. And Caesar had instructed them before to leave the water lying around for a while so it could warm up. And they didn't do it. That was freezing cold water. And Tolkien, who was an old lefty radical, thought it was alienated labor getting back at all these highly paid performers to pour freezing cold water on them.
So next was Caesar's Hour, and we can talk a little bit about that. But what had happened in the 4 or 5 years that he was on the air and to Show of Shows, and began also to happen to Caesar's Hour in terms of ratings and in terms of how television was expanding and kind of leaving Caesar behind?
Well, what happened was that your Show of Shows, in its 5th season, Caesar got kind of tired of working for someone else and was turning into, he'd already become a bona fide star and he wanted his own TV show. And oddly enough, even though they seemed like the perfect pair, he wanted to leave Imogene Coca behind. I think he was partly jealous of her because she had an enormous following and people really loved her. You can see, I mean, she was really a lovable character where, as you were saying before, Caesar was kind of remote and he just wanted his own operation. So that was the beginning of Caesar's Hour, where many of the most famous and most ingenious and elaborate sketches appeared. And that was where the famous writer's room really existed, not on your Show of Shows, where there were only 3 writers. I mean, the writer's room of lore was on Caesar's Hour when there were 7, and at one time Larry Gelbart, Mel Brooks, and Neil Simon were all working for Caesar at once in that room. But as you mentioned before, television was spreading beyond the urban areas and into the countryside, like by capillary action in a way. And the audiences were changing and didn't really cotton to Caesar. I mean, Caesar was peddling an elite intellectual kind of comedy. And people in the sticks felt that Caesar was kind of talking down to them. And they resented him. And that's where Lawrence Welk comes into the picture. And ABC, which was the 3rd network at that point and really just getting started, put Welk next against Caesar in the last season, and he clobbered him in the ratings. And it really is interesting because Caesar prided himself on a gentle kind of comedy. I mean, there's nothing offensive. It's ingenious, but it's not offensive, which was one of the neat tricks that he pulled off. But he could see that the Lawrence Welk and the Lawrence Welks of the world were going to knock him off. I mean, it was, the popular taste was changing, and television was catering to these larger, more rural audiences. And so, in 4 weeks, he did 3 takeoffs on Lawrence Welk. And again, nobody has seen these in decades, and they're absolutely vicious. Very uncharacteristic of Caesar and great fun to see. So I
couldn't find one.
You couldn't. They're at the Paley Center. I mean, they're not online. That's the thing. I mean, they're all available. And that was his vengeance, but it didn't do any good. And Welk knocked him off the air. Carl Reiner had a very simple explanation. He said, he's funnier than we are.
We're running a little long here, and I want to leave room for questions before the National Arts Club throws us out, but I really would be remiss if I didn't show you a little bit of more of Caesar's genius in the gibberish, the double talk, that he, as you explained much earlier, that he picked up because he had an ear for it, you know, among the industrial workers that came into his life, you know, in his father's restaurant. So can we play that?
Kings of American comedy, Mr. Sid Caesar.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Le parti mardi sur la bien piquant. Est-ce que vous êtes le petit piano se dirait le ridiculeux de Reiner et de Bob Hope? Est-ce que vous entendez le titre de mi mère tout de mi appartient événement? Il regarde, ici me le démanteau de mes quatre gammes. Vous en avez un Victor Hugo. Merde, Victor Hugo. Vous en avez un Victor Henri Balzac. Vous en avez un truc peut-être si me l'a pas crayon. On a dit tant que d'Émile Zola. Des grands bébés le boss Guten Abend, meine Herren, meine Herren. Bolzak met een riefvaart gesluit maar waar. De anderen in Schubert met eindelijk die valt wat een Reufel en Schleider Bax Plank. Ma cosa fai? Ma la piace deve che la mia piadare. Ma con lei via lo rosso di la mia la Bob Hope, ma con lo ben mele, ma tutta la mamma mia la chiudo la iara. Siamo noi non la pensa per la piscio baccalà, che non me la piatto le piscine, la gara. La galata non sono galati. Michelangelo, che per la piatto, che la lamba la gato, le piace, le pietre solo, la gara. Sono le villa, Leonardo da Vinci, la copinammiato, sono la Mona Lisa. E la corre vita da Bob Hope, ma cosa fa la piace di iniziare?
There's a story, I think it's in your book, I don't know if I picked this up somewhere else, but he met Eisenhower at some point before Eisenhower was president. Is that your story?
Yeah, that was that was in the book, and it was at the Waldorf Astoria. He was performing at the Waldorf Astoria, and I think Eisenhower. I think he wasn't president yet. He was, I think he was president of Columbia University at that point, maybe. Anyway, Eisenhower heard him do Russian double talk, and he said, "Where'd you pick up such good Russian?" He thought. I mean, he was that persuasive. I mean, what's interesting about the double talk, apart from its political incorrectness now, and you can get away with it in these languages, but as you felt, like the Japanese double talk, you know, you could never have it on the air now. But what's interesting is that it was something that he developed very early in his life for the reasons that we talked about, his inability to sort of have a normal conversation and hiding behind various comedic devices. But later on in his life, this was his go-to default position.
He did it a lot of events.
He did it a lot, and it was something that he fled to very quickly whenever he made appearances later on. The first time I saw Caesar was at a testimonial at the Pierre Hotel in 2000. And again, he was introduced and he spoke for a couple of minutes and made absolutely no sense. And then then he launched into this. You know, when he was on television shows, like in the 70s, when he was really out of it, when alcohol and tranquilizers and everything had really eaten up his brain, there were lots of comics who tried to be nice to him and keep him going. I mean, he had a 20-year blackout period when he was really out of commission. And comedians who remembered how important he had been in their careers and how influential he'd been tried to prop him up and give him a helping hand and keep him out there. People like Jackie Gleason, not a guy known for his generosity, to put it mildly, had him on his show many times just to sort of keep him alive comedically. Johnny Carson was the same way. Johnny Carson had studied all of Caesar's famous sketches and brought him on when there was a compilation of shows that came out in 1972. And so and Dick Cavett was another one who had him on many times, and he was making no sense on Cavett's show. And Cavett would say to him, well, how would they react to this in Japan? Or how would they have reacted in Germany? And that would give him an invitation to start this kind of thing. And that's what he did the night that I heard him at this testimonial in New York in 2000. It became, in a way, it was his first refuge, and it became his last refuge.
I want to, in 1 minute, open it for questions, whatever you have on your mind. And I just want to say, go back to the saxophone that sort of began his life in the sense that he discovered what he could potentially do. And you end the book with the saxophone. And if you'll tell a little of that story, I would like to quote your last paragraph.
Well, the story was just that when I interviewed Caesar, I interviewed him in 2008, which will give you some kind of an idea of how long this book has been in the works.
Since the Taft administration.
Right, yeah, right. But anyway, when I interviewed him, I didn't ask him about the saxophone, but it was at his house. And I later asked his daughter what had ever happened to it. And it was sitting in a closet, in the bottom of a closet, underneath a pile of clothes. And he hadn't played it for a very long time. And to me, it represented really how he'd given up in a way that I would have thought the saxophone would have given him a certain kind of comfort, but he was beyond even that, really. But part of the challenge in doing the book was that Caesar was not really literate any more than he was voluble conversationally. There are no Caesar papers. There are very few Caesar letters. He just wasn't somebody who communicated like that. And there were no Caesar archives, so I had to really work from scratch. And he'd gotten rid of all of his memorabilia, but he never got rid of the saxophone. Does that set things up? He held on to the saxophone.
And you wondered why, and this is the last two sentences of a remarkable, eloquent book. As someone, this is David writing about why he thought Caesar kept that saxophone. As someone who never stopped believing in the souls of everyday objects, who'd even apologized to a trash can, maybe he feared hurting its feelings or appearing ungrateful. After all, that simple piece of brass had given him more unalloyed happiness than anything or anyone ever had. David Margolick.
Louder. Joyce Wadler, I'm a writer. David, you're describing Sid Caesar at the end of his life as a broken man. Why do you think he was a broken man? Was there a brain illness? Was it drugs? Why?
Well, in fact, Joyce, you're going to force me properly to clarify that a little bit. He was a broken man until he went clean. Okay, in 1980 or so, he had a breakdown in the middle of a performance, and after that, he decided that he really as he said, he was going to die if he didn't stop drinking and pill popping. And then he went clean. And actually, after that, for the next however many years it was over 25 years, he was formally broken. He wasn't broken after that. And in fact, he never really worked again very much. I mean, he appeared in films like Grease that people remember, and he got some television gigs, but he didn't work very much. The more important thing was that his head was clear for the first time, in many years. And he sort of assumed the role of an elder statesman in a way. He really wasn't very functional. I mean, you could see that he had these crutches that he used when he appeared publicly. But I think he was relatively contented at the end. And he gave, as I say, the best interviews he ever gave. I mean, the first cogent interviews in many, many years, and thoughtful interviews. And that was my experience with him. When I talked to him, he had a hospital bed in his home. This was 6 years before he died. He was already very fragile, but he was cogent and witty. We watched a couple of the old sketches together. I played the one from This Is Your Life. I played that, and the famous one of the German general getting dressed, who turns out to be a doorman, and another classic Caesar sketch with Howard Morris. And I think, so at that point, he was sort of, I think he was contented. He had saved a lot of money. He was making, in his heyday, in 1954, he was making $25,000 a week, which is over $300,000 a week by today's dollar. I mean, that's, so when you're making that kind of money, you can afford to put some of it away. And so he lived comfortably, and I think I think that he was a shadow of what he had been, but he was no longer broken.
By the way, David mentioned earlier the sturgeon, $5 a pound, and he felt he made it. The other day I checked with the Gary Greengrasses. It's $72 a pound now.
I'm Ray Hoffman, a former colleague of the former Tony Guida at WCBS. And my question is, you talked about how the tank was basically empty at the end of the NBC run. I know there was a series that he did on ABC around 1963, and I think it was on like every 3 weeks or something like that. Have you seen any of those shows? I never have, and I'm wondering if there was any spark that was ready to burst alive again.
It's a very, I have, there are only a couple episodes of it. It was done with Second City. So he had an infusion of, there were 2 different shows, but one of them was done with Second City, and it appeared very periodically, he's not great in them, but he's got a better supporting cast, and so they're not bad, but they weren't, he couldn't keep it going, and there was no interest in it. In fact, people complained that the commercials that he did were funnier than the sketches, because at that point, he had inherited one of those shows from Ernie Kovacs after Kovacs had been killed, and Dutch Masters was the advertiser, and he did these kind of Lucille Ball-like sketches where he had to keep doing them one take after the other, and he got more and more drunk, and they're actually quite funny. But one of the commentators, Harriet Van Horn, said it's too bad that he doesn't stick just with the commercials because they're funnier than the sketches.
Ellen Freilich, I'll just skip the resume. I just want to thank you for this really entertaining cultural history, which taught me a lot about TV just before I was born, and most importantly, sent me back to the sketches on YouTube, which are incredible. It's the clock. We've all been in those German squares when the clocks come on. And also, when you mentioned Tamament, I immediately thought, wasn't that in Marjorie Morningstar? And immediately you said, yes, it's in Marjorie Morningstar. And then I was thinking, was My Favorite Year, which is one of my favorite movies, inspired by this? And I guess on page 300, because I looked up in the index, apparently it was. But none of those people who were in the original really liked the movie. But the movie's not a documentary, it's a movie, so.
Right. Yeah, they all hated the movie for 2 reasons. They felt that the kind of mayhem that the movie depicted was unfair to them because, as we said, the show was very meticulously scripted and never degenerated into that kind of thing. So they felt that it was unfair to the work that they had done. That was the first reason that they hated it. And the second reason was that Mel Brooks was the executive producer. And they felt that it was, that it was a vehicle for him, and that chirpy guy, the Mark Lynn Baker character in the movie was modeled after Mel Brooks and became a more important character in the movie than the Sid Caesar character played by Joe Bologna. So there was a lot of unhappiness, and again, that unhappiness that Frank Rich tapped into is all in the letters between them, where they're all bad-mouthing each other.
Hi, Leslie Wayne, New York Times alum. Dave, my question is, when you talked about Sid Caesar and you talked about his personality being very hidden and unknowable, 2 names popped into my mind, which is Johnny Carson and Dave Letterman, who seem to have that same sort of opaque quality. What is it with comedians that lends itself to that, where you seem to be a person who's very well known, but also unknowable at the same time? And is there something about being a comedian that lends itself, or personalities that lend themselves to being comedians?
Well, I think it's the second. I think that people like that go into comedy, and comedy just accentuates that, and comedic fame accentuates it even more. So they really become recluses in a way. But as I say, it was interesting, and this is something that I encountered throughout my reporting, and Johnny Carson is another example of it, but not the only one, that we all, so many of us in this room know what it's like to interview celebrities and how fruitless it often is, and how frustrating it is. You got to go through all kinds of hoops to get to them, and then they give you the same shit all the time with their stock answers and everything, and it's infuriating. The difference in reporting a book like this, Leslie, was that everybody to whom I spoke about Caesar was incredibly forthcoming. And there were two reasons for that. The first is, and this applied particularly to Mel Brooks and Woody Allen, whom I also interviewed, they felt that he had influenced them he had influenced each of them profoundly, and they wanted to proclaim that from the rooftops. They wanted to acknowledge how important Sid Caesar was to them. Mel Brooks has often said, "No Sid Caesar, no Mel Brooks," and it's absolutely right, because he plucked them out of nowhere. I mean, Sid was not known, as I say, for his one-liners, but he had a good one about Mel. He said, when I found Mel, he was living underneath a hovel. So he found Mel and plucked him out from beneath the hovel. And then when Mel was irritating everybody else, Sid paid him out of his own pocket and protected him and ended up launching him. Woody Allen came along later and didn't work as long with Sid, but felt the same way, and lots of other people. That was one reason. They wanted to acknowledge their debt to him. And the second reason was that they felt that history had shafted Caesar and not given him his due, and they wanted to restore him to his pedestal. And that was another reason why they were never begrudging with me. They wanted to talk about him.
Did Sid Caesar have to be manic to be funny? Because when he stopped taking pills and drinking alcohol, he was no longer funny.
Well, not only manic, but he had to be heavy. He lost a lot of weight, and people didn't recognize him anymore. And there was nothing sort of funny about his appearance. It was funny, but it was odd, and he looked anemic, and he lost a lot of his comic appeal just because, it would have been like Oliver Hardy suddenly, becoming anorectic. It just didn't look right. And there was nothing funny when you looked at him. In fact, it was painful to look at him, and, he just stopped being funny. I saw Richard Cohen the other night, and Richard was recounting how he'd seen the late Caesar somewhere or other, and Caesar had made him laugh. And he said, "Sid, that's the first time I've ever laughed at you in color." Caesar was funny in black and white, and then it stopped.
All right, Scotty, last question.
Why him? Why Sid Caesar?
Why did I?
That was a short.
Well, because, as I say, it was for a Jewish book series, and I wanted to write a book about a Jew who would make me laugh for a change. No, there are, the thing, like Groucho Marx had already been taken.
I get no royalties from the sale of this thing, but I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts about why you should buy the book. We don't have more time, but I have to tell you that, an important issue that David goes into in the book is why Caesar shunned politics. There was no politics in his humor. There was the war going on. There was the Red Scare. There was the Lavender Scare. It's in the book. The other thing that's in the book is the call he got from Albert Einstein's office about Sid Caesar. Sid Caesar, it's in the book, the call he got from Albert Einstein's office. Albert wanted a meeting. David Margolick, it's great to have you.
Yes, it was polite.